Welcome to Preparing Proper PowerPoints. We're going to talk in this video about how you should go about designing and implementing your PowerPoints to get the most effective presentations when you are doing these in a professional setting. Again, this is all about being professional with your PowerPoints, so if you're doing this for some other purpose, these rules may not apply as much, but for the purposes of business settings and working in companies and in school, this is probably the way you want to go with most of your PowerPoint presentations. So the first thing I want to kick off with is talking about the fonts that you guys are going to use. One of the key things is that you have to remember this is probably something that's going to be projected or shown on a screen, so you want to make sure your fonts are big enough for somebody to read, especially in the back. So the smallest font on your slide should be at least 20 points because it really does suck for your viewer if you use tiny fonts, and most of us have been in presentations where somebody's used little fonts and it really does make it hard to read and follow along with what's going on. So we want to make sure, number one, that we use large enough fonts. The second thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we use what we call non-serif fonts. And some of you are like, what the heck is a serif? Well, if you look on here, you can see it's these little lines at the bottom of the T and at the end of the S here. Those are serifs, and they work great for enabling people to read things that are on paper when printed in black and white. Unfortunately, when we project it, the pixels on the screens tend to be larger, and it causes these letters to actually run together and become more difficult for your viewer. So when you're doing a projected presentation, you want to use block type fonts, such as this Arial font that's being used up here. This is designed specifically to enable people to read it on a projection because it's blocked, therefore the larger pixels don't interfere with your audience reading it as much. So we really want to do that. So big fonts, non-serif fonts, and appropriate fonts. Third thing, appropriate fonts. Basically, you want to make sure you send the proper message with your presentation. Now this font down here may look fun, or it may look spooky, and if you're doing a flyer for a Halloween event with your fraternity or sorority or some other organization, that's great. But when we're presenting in a professional capacity, we want to make sure that we use the right type of font. You know, it looks fun, but what does it say to your audience? That's what you got to ask yourself. So think about the message your font sends as well. And the fourth thing about fonts is you got to make sure they stand out from the background. I mean, if you look at this, you know, we can stare at this, but there you can sort of make it out on your screen. If you look really closely right here, it says, "Can you read this?" But your audience doesn't want to work hard. They're kind of like the rest of us. We're all inherently lazy creatures as people. And if you make it difficult for your audience to read your slides, they're not going to. And they're probably going to stop paying attention to what you have to say because now you're making them work and they just really don't want to. So to be a good presenter and to create good PowerPoints, we need to have large enough fonts to make it easy for our audience to read. Again, less work. We want to make it so that we use non-serif fonts so it's easy for them to read when it's projected. Again, less work. We want to make sure we're sending the proper message with our fonts. And finally, we want to make sure that it stands out from the background so it's easily readable. In psychology, we call this phenomenon the figure ground phenomena. In other words, this white stands out from the gray background, the dark gray background. It's very easy to read. Now, the dark gray on dark gray, not as easy to read, and therefore there's no contrast between the figure, which is the letters, and the ground, which is the background. So we want to make sure we do all four of those things. So that's fonts. Now let's move into the background. I'm just going to take a second here and let you guys get it out of your system because most of you are staring at the hamsters and probably the whale. And you're not really paying attention to what's being said. And that's the challenge that you as a presenter have when you put some sort of interesting picture or background, something up there that grabs your audience's attention. Yeah, it can be handy, keeps them engaged, but sometimes it dominates what you're saying. You know, this picture of the whale set as a background, you're probably not going to keep your audience's attention. They're looking at that going, ooh. So what you want to do is make sure the background doesn't dominate what you're trying to say, it doesn't take away from it. And then there's the whole animated thing. If you have an animated background, it's going to distract your audience. You know, yes, it may be cute to do it one time, but if you do this for your entire presentation, by the end of it, your audience is going to want to strangle the poor dancing hamsters. You don't want that. You want something that's informative, especially in a professional setting. You don't want to distract your audience. You don't want to make it harder for them. You don't want to irritate them. So, another thing that you can see in this slide, you know, yes, the dancing hamsters are funny, but it's also hard to read this because we have dark waves and dark text here. It goes back to that whole contrast thing. Yeah, oh, it's not the same color. Yeah, but it doesn't stand out well enough either. It makes it hard to read. So you want to make sure that you don't overbear your your presentation with your background. You don't distract your audience with it. You don't take away from you as the presenter with what you have on the slides. Because something important to keep in mind as we go through all of this is that your slides are a tool to support what you're trying to do. They aren't the presentation. You as the speaker are the presentation, and this is one tool that you can use to communicate the information you're sharing with your audience. So we want to remember not to let the background dominate what we say. We don't want it animated on every slide. Yes, occasionally an animation can work, but we don't want the whole thing because by the end your audience is really going to get tired of it. And you want to make sure that background doesn't hide any information you're trying to communicate. Or do something like this. Sorry about that. Most of you probably weren't expecting that, but that bright background, I mean, that's just going to irritate your audience for an entire presentation. And especially if you add that clashing font color, I mean, it can make them just not want to pay attention to it. It kind of hurts their heads, gives them a headache, makes it an unpleasant experience. When you communicate with your audience, you want it to be a pleasant experience. So, in a professional setting, good background color choices and good font combinations are very important. That's better. So, when we get into content, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. Apparently, number one is you shouldn't write everything on the slide. Because at this point, you guys have probably read all the way through what's on this slide. And that's what happens when you put every sentence on there. People get in the habit of writing every single thing they want to say on their slide, so they don't have to remember it. It's a security blanket thing. The problem is that if you do this and you project this up, your audience can read 3 to 4 times faster than you can speak. The average person speaks about 90 words a minute to 120 words a minute. Normal people can read up to 400 words a minute. So, if people are reading that much faster than you're speaking, and you write everything up there, they don't need you. And they'll miss out on the important things you say because they'll dedicate 100% of their awareness to reading your slide thinking they've got all the information. So then suddenly you start talking about a different topic like polar bears, and they go, wait, what? And they're lost. So instead, what you need to do is have highlights. Bullet points. There's a rule called the 5x5 rule, the 6x6, or the 8x8 rule, depending on who you talk to when it comes to designing your slides. But all these rules have in common is that you should have a limited number of bullet points on every slide, somewhere between 5 and 8, and a limited number of words on each line, somewhere between 5 and 8 again. So the idea is that if you do that, if you limit yourself to that amount of information per slide, you won't write an entire paragraph. You won't have a ton of information on there. And that means that you, as the presenter, then fill in the gaps. So you have a highlight. So, if you're talking about, a key presentation on the history of entrepreneurship in the workplace, you may have 3 things up there. You may have 3M. You may have and you just have the name of a couple of companies listed up there. And then you, as the presenter, would fill in how they helped contribute to entrepreneurship in the workplace. Or if you're giving a presentation on major battles of the War of 1812, you might have a list of 5 or 6 battles, including the Battle of New Orleans and a couple of others on there, with not a ton of detail. Maybe you have the name and the date. And then you, as the presenter, would fill in the relevant information. Why is it important? Why is it up here? What happened? What was the key outcomes? Those kind of things. So, again, the slides aren't the presentation. You are. Use this as a way to create giant note cards that everybody can follow along with, and then you fill in the detail. If you go ahead and fill in the detail on the slide, nobody pays attention, and they wonder why they're there listening to you. You could have just sent them this novel that you've written in PowerPoint format. Then there's the action and animation settings. It seems like people really love the fact that they can make their stuff do all kinds of cool things on PowerPoint. Ooh, I can make letters appear. I can do all kinds of stuff. It's stuff like that. That sound clip is annoying because if I do every letter like that or something like this, you guys might get annoyed after a while because that's not something in the audience you want to sit through. It's an unpleasant experience. We got to stop that because it's really, really annoying. But what you want to do is, yes, you can do some action settings to make certain things stand out. Key points, key bullets, maybe hide something and have it appear so that it underscores at a point you're trying to make. Those are fine. What we run into, though, is people do things like that where they're dropping every single letter in, and it loses any meaning, it loses any emphasis, and it actually causes people to not enjoy your presentation instead of enhancing your presentation. We also get this a lot with people using Prezi. I don't know if any of you have used this before, but it's another presentation software besides PowerPoint. It's probably the second most common one. And it has a lot of action and motion and movement, and it's supposed to be very artistic. The problem is it may make your audience seasick, and I've seen it do it before. By the time you're done watching a Prezi presentation, you're trying to figure out if you're going to throw up or applaud. And that's not what we want to have happen. We want our audience to enjoy the presentation, to get something out of it. If the presentation overshadows the content by the way that it's presented, we've got a problem. Another problem that people have is they fall in love with transitioning between slides. You don't need a ton of wipes with a ton of sound. I make a reference here to Super Friends. If you're old like me, this was a cartoon that was on Saturday mornings, and every time they went from one scene to another, they had this big, loud, spectacular transition they called a star wipe. We've seen it in other shows too. That kind of stuff like this doesn't get you anything. Another thing we've got to keep in mind here is that if you're going to use video clips, that's a perfectly fine way to enhance what you're doing. The problem is that many of us fall in love with it, and you go, oh, I've got a 5-minute presentation, so I'm going to put 3.5 minutes worth of clips in there, then I don't have to say anything. Again, that's not the right way to do it. The proper way to approach video clips is as a way to support what you're presenting. Another thing that happens with video clips is that they distract. If you sit there and play a 10-minute video clip, your audience's attention span is probably going to be gone after a minute or two. Because what happens is, it turns out that most of us have the attention span less than a goldfish. Goldfish actually have an attention span of about 8 to 10 seconds. Most college students nowadays have an attention span of 5 to 6 seconds. So, in order to get the most effectiveness out of your video clips, use them sparingly, use them only if they reinforce a point, and don't try to use them as a replacement for you, the presenter. The video should support the points you're trying to make, but the moment that you try to use them as a replacement for you, you're doing it wrong. You are the presentation. The video clip is just evidence of what you're trying to share. Another thing that people tend to do in their presentations besides video clips is sounds. The moment you have to put applause in your own presentation, that's a bad sign. That means you're not doing it right. The audience should applaud on their own. The other thing about sound effects, so like if it makes a noise every time something pops up, that gets annoying and irritating too, and it takes away from the audience's experience. So don't have distracting sounds. Use your video clips sparingly. Don't have distracting sounds. And at the end of the day, these aren't just my ideas. If you look at this, if you look at what I say, and then watch this video here, we're going to pull this up in just a second, this is what's key. These are the things that people find annoying about PowerPoint. They find them distracting. So let's listen to what this comedian has to say about PowerPoint. Hopefully from that, you were able to pick up on some of the things that happen that are annoying to your audience when you do PowerPoints. Things like overcrowding slides, too much information, bad font choices, bad color schemes. These are all important things to keep in mind. So the next question many of you will have is, how do I get Meas credit for this workshop? So, to wrap this up, first off, you have to have watched the video. And then you're going to come to the Meas Center. And you're going to bring with you a 7-slide or longer PowerPoint that you're doing specifically for a class. And when you come in, you're going to have to bring that presentation along with a description of the assignment so that either the Meas mentors or myself, Dr. Fleming, can look over your PowerPoint and go down the checklist based on this presentation to make sure that you've met the guidelines for a good PowerPoint presentation. There are hours scheduled with me, or you can do walk-in hours with the Meas mentors. Once again, bring a 7-slide or longer PowerPoint for a class along with its description of the assignment to the Meas Center in order to get credit for this. Once you've completed all the guidelines and gotten your check sheet done, you'll be good to go. So hopefully this presentation will teach you and has taught you lots of things to do to improve your PowerPoint.